I think the intelligence function of government is woefully under-theorized and often very casually organized at the moment compared to what it could be and indeed should be. I think this is so blindingly obvious in this century that, we are surrounded by clever machine intelligence and we just need to be thinking about this all the time. But I'm still stunned how many governments I go to which haven't really got this basic fact of the era they're in.
Well, Geoff, thank you so much for joining me and sharing some of your ideas and insights about the future of government. You talked a lot about this importance of intelligence and how intelligence is so important to the effective running of an organization, a business, a government. Obviously, what is possible with intelligence now is shifting dramatically, partly because I'm thinking like communications with the social media. That is a way that we gather intelligence is through this disconnected, or not disconnected, but like decentralized information space. But then now we also have these new tools which can be really powerful intelligence gathering and synthesizing tools such as AI. How does that shift the way you think about how governments work with intelligence?
If we'd been having this conversation 2,000 years ago, we would be doing it on a screen, obviously. But intelligence then was central to the work of government, but it meant a rather narrow set of things. It meant knowing, is the enemy about to attack us? So you had lots of spies out there. Knowing if your own people were unhappy and might be about to revolt. Again, you'd have lots of spies doing that. And you'd have intelligence for tax collection. You'd be measuring, the scale of land, the amount of each harvest, and so on. So in a way, it's not new that intelligence is core to a lot of the functioning of real life government. It's just that now it applies to everything, not just to security and tax. It applies to, primary schooling or transport or fixing unemployment or the care needs of the elderly too. And that means that governments need a much wider repertoire of tools. Some of them are just about data, knowing what's going on. You can, with satellite observations or statistics or gathering stuff from the internet. It's interpreting those so is something a big problem or a small problem, an emerging problem. If there's a mobile phone burglary epidemic on the streets of London, as there has been, you need to know that. And you need to be able to know what explains it, otherwise you won't be able to fix it. But there are all sorts of other kinds of intelligence which are important to any kind of complex decision making. Often you need to tap into tacit knowledge, especially of your frontline staff. A typical government may employ hundreds of thousands of teachers or frontline police officers or nurses, and they will see things you won't get through the management structures or through the formal data. And there's lots of new ways of tapping into that everyday knowledge. You need some knowledge of the future, what might be about to hit us. It could be a new pandemic. It could be some weird thing from quantum computing. So again, you need a capacity for foresight, for thinking ahead. And then the other part of intelligence is creativity, is the ability to generate new options all the time. And that's why I think every government had to have innovation teams of all kinds and challenges and processes to tap into creativity. Now, all those kinds of intelligence are ones we have in our own brains. The individual is always observing, interpreting, remembering, creating, thinking ahead. That's what we do reasonably well as humans. And I think that's almost exactly what we need good government to do, possibly a bit better than we do it as individuals. But it will only happen if they have capacities for each of those things and they can pull them together in an integrated synthetic way to make judgments like about how much should we be doing for climate change this year? How quickly do we close our coal industries or move from gas to electricity or to electric vehicles? Complex judgments which require all of these different kinds of intelligence, but then have to be synthesized into some decisions and policies. And I think the intelligence function of government is woefully under-theorized at the moment and often very casually organized at the moment compared to what it could be and indeed should be. I think that will change because I think this is so blindingly obvious in this century that, we are surrounded by clever machine intelligence and we just need to be thinking about this all the time. But I'm still stunned how many governments I go to which haven't really got this basic fact of the era they're in.
So this raises a question. I'm trying to think how to frame this question. But one of the challenges I see a lot of my contemporaries in government in governments particularly across the West, is this nervousness around intelligence. And I guess where I want to go is this whole idea of surveillance, this whole
Mhm.
idea of big brother government. And
Mm.
it's almost like a counterpoint to, and I know you've done some research in this area, like China's, I think, a really interesting example. They've kind of gone the other direction. And as a result, they have an incredible amount of collective intelligence the government controls in China. But there is this sort of it seems like, and maybe this is a false dichotomy between intelligence and surveillance and individual freedoms and liberty and the sphere of Big Brother. But I do see that as a tension that is holding a lot of people I know who work in government back, is that fear around being too much surveillance, too much Big Brother.
Especially in Europe, there's a great fear either of being China, an all-knowing Big Brother state watching your other movement, or of the US, of actually the big platform knowing everything you do. I mean, Google knows, a hell of a lot about what I do, much more than the British government, and they're not accountable to me in any way. So there's a deep anxiety about the power of these technologies, and in particular the data trails which we leave every time we buy something, we travel anywhere, and so on. And to my mind, in a way, there's a twin answer. On the one hand, we get huge value if we can link up different data sets. That's the power of data. But it becomes even more important that that is done with privacy protection and with accountability for how that data is used. So I've long advocated that we need new kinds of institution, which are data trusts, publicly accountable data trusts, charged with maximizing the public value from data, but without infringing on individual liberty. I do not want government ministers and officials to know, where I'm going to go in an hour's time. It's none of their business. They don't need to know any of that. But I do want a transport planning system which can use all the different data on walking and cycling and driving and trains and planes and so on to have a rational planning system. It can use largely anonymized data for that. I want a health system which can make the most of extraordinary amounts of data about personal health, about genomics, about socioeconomic condition, link those together to better prevent, warn, help for diseases. I had a fascinating conversation yesterday in Denmark, which has one of the most advanced AI tools for child maltreatment. A little bit like similar ones in Pennsylvania, in the US, and in the UK, which tries to gather a lot of data about families and police records and this, that, and the other. So that if there is a call to a hotline for child maltreatment, you can better assess the risk. How likely is this to end up in violence and harm for the child? Now, Denmark, I thought, had done the best I'd seen in the world in really bringing an extraordinary number of data sets together for this. But they've got cold feet in the last few months, I was told, even on that. And at the moment, we don't have a place to weigh up the public value against the risks. My own view is what they were doing there. The public value almost certainly outweighed some of the risks of infringing on personal liberty. But that's a judgment which has to be made. And at the moment, we don't have institutions publicly making that judgment, which will be different in the case of crime or AI and cancer or school data. And it's one of many fields where we're missing the crucial institutions we need to make the big decisions of our current era. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I'm obsessed with institutional design, because I don't see any way of resolving these sets of problems without legitimate institutions making some of those judgments and then being accountable to us for those judgments.
Well, it's the legitimacy question, I think, that's the interesting one. Just there's a conversation I had with my own family a couple of weeks ago that really stuck with me. My little sister asked me about my thoughts on the UK's digital ID system. And I'm like, where did this come from? But we had this interesting conversation about it. And what I realized is that there's a lot of concern I think a lot of people have of we, I think, are in some ways intentionally keeping government anemic and weak because we're afraid of what a powerful government would look like in the wrong hands. And to me, that comes down to this idea of trust, and trust in government and government institutions is so low right now that we are more comfortable with governments being incompetent than we are with them being competent. We're actually scared of them being incompetent. And so we, I think, intentionally undermine them to a certain extent. I think we're becoming scared of private sector companies now as well. And so I'm really intrigued by how do we build institutions that people trust and have legitimacy in people's eyes, that they would be comfortable with being so powerful in terms of the intelligence that they have, and then turning that into huge public value. Because I think that works if there's trust. If there isn't trust, we're uncomfortable with that power.
Absolutely. And trust levels in government vary a lot in different countries. It's very important not to generalize from the US. which has very low levels of trust and has for quite a long time, whereas a country like a Denmark, where I just was, or Finland, where I'll be next week, it's pretty high still in government. Government is fairly competent, fairly trusted, and gets on with stuff and can actually do things with data which would be harder in other countries. If they lost that trust, it would be much harder for them. But you're absolutely right. Without trust, forget it. And Britain probably won't get a digital ID card because there isn't sufficient level of trust. There's also another story here, of course, if we're not to be naive, is the cheerleaders of the big private platforms have always been deliberately encouraging this sense that government can't be trusted with data because that guaranteed they would not be regulated on their use of data, which allows a Meta or a Google to have these much richer, better informed pictures of citizens than the national governments they're negotiating with. And there was an deliberate ideological plan there. There are real conspiracies of them, and that one has worked pretty successfully in much of the world.
So, okay, this vision that we talk about where government needs to go in the future is one that is intelligent and uses data really effectively, not just basic data, but like foresight and all sorts of different types of information to be intelligent about what it does. It's a government that is agile and fluid and therefore able to respond quickly to the way the world changes so rapidly. And it's one that is very much decentralized and able to, therefore it's flexible in that sense. Is there anything else I've missed in terms of characteristics when you think of that government of the future that we're moving towards, preparing for? Pretty interesting conversation, eh? Well, if you want to catch the rest of my conversation with Geoff, you can find it on the Civic Punks podcast, which I have linked in the description here for this video. And make sure to like and subscribe to get more videos just like this one.